there's still an if here about how much AI is going to take over. And there's certainly a when. And it's definitely not clear that AI can reduce or make the time management efficient enough to account for this growing disparity. It's hard to predict the future, right? We don't know. When it comes to AI, are there more flights across the U.S. now in the post-advent of autopilot or before? Are there more flights, more pilots, right, or fewer? And people, I'm sure, would worry fewer, but no. There's a lot more pilots now than there were before and that's because there's so many more flights because it enables so many pilots.
Welcome to Frame by Frame, Rethink Imaging, a podcast by Imalogics. Here, we explore the intricate world of medical imaging, aiming to dissect the field and inspire both professionals and curious minds alike. I'm your host, Chris St. John. Welcome back to Frame by Frame, Rethink Imaging. For this episode, we're going to be digging into the future of radiology at a higher level. What needs to change, what habits we need to let go of, what new technology is coming in, and how we can build smarter and more sustainable practices moving forward. Today, we're joined by Dr. Ari Goldberg, and he's in a fantastic position to reflect on this. Ari recently finished his role at Loyola, where he directed body imaging and MRI operations, and also led one of the largest professional societies in the field. Ari is also the former president of the Chicago Radiological Society and an executive board member of the Illinois Radiological Society. So he's got both a ground level and a wonderful bird's eye view of where radiology is and where it needs to go. Today, we'll talk about what's working, what isn't, and what kind of shifts in the field we might need to embrace over the next decade. Welcome, Ari.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here today. I was recently just talking with Dr. Summer Kaplan in our last episode about shielding practices, and we were talking a lot about these practices in imaging that we've been doing it because that's how it used to be done. Are there assumptions in radiology practice that you think no longer really serve us very well?
I do. I think a lot of that comes down to, honestly, how we report the studies, how we interpret and report the studies. And what I mean by that is there was a time where I think it was Hopkins, but there were several places where they would basically put a little disclaimer in the report that said something along the lines of anything not mentioned in the report you can assume is normal. For example, so a head CT that was normal got reported out as normal brain or normal head CT or something like that. And everybody was just fine then. And, we've gone away from that. We've gone away to sort of, for various reasons, we've gone away to, it's for teaching, sometimes it's for insurance. There's different reasons we've gone away to kind of these, let alone template reports, but these way of reporting and thinking about things that are very organized is a good thing, but let's just stick with that. Very, very templated in a certain sense. And I think that that's part of a practice in radiology of sometimes focusing and spending time describing things that we know are not really clinically relevant. And I think that we're in this stage now, which doesn't really have a particular end in sight, where we do not have enough radiologists to read the amount of work. That disparity is only going to increase. Now, somebody come along and say, there's all these things that are coming that's going to fix that. But in the meantime, we don't know, and we're so stuck with that disparity. And so I think that is one thing that I notice across the board that everybody does, right? Everybody to varying degrees gets bogged down in things. We can call them incidental findings, we can call them normal structures, whatever you want to call it. That is really, it fulfills like a neuroses of sorts and maybe some kind of medical legal, still a neuroses, honestly. And we all do that. And I think that's something we have to think about letting go as we move forward.
Just for my own clarification. So what you're saying is like, if you're looking at an image for something very specific and you might see like other potential artifacts in that image, you're supposed to just ignore them?
Well, not artifacts, but there's all sorts of structures, lesions, whatever you want to call them, that we recognize, that we know are benign or not clinically important. And we still feel the necessity to describe those, to measure those, and so those are things that both, that process, this the way, it's a compound thing, right? If you're going to put it down in your report, it means you probably spent too long looking at it to begin with. So that over the course of a day, a week, month, that's up to a lot of time. And I think that the education around how we interpret and then our interpretation as whoever's, as practicing radiologists really is going to have to shift, because we're just not going to be able to, we're not going to be able to spend that amount of time given the workload.
So what would that shift look like in your mind then? Like, what would be the practice?
I think the practice would return more towards trusting ourselves to not mention everything. Something that I look at for a split second, and in my mind, I know that's benign, that's not important. I don't report that. I don't measure it. Like a cyst on the kidney could be an example, because there's gazillions of examples, and that's the problem, right? They're in every organ system, in every kind of situation, inpatient, outpatient. So it would look like that. It would look like there would be a lot more reports that sort of said something along the lines of, this is normal. This is what's wrong. And other things that are not described have nothing to do with what's wrong. And I've given you all the clinical information that you really need. There are ideas out there that have been toyed around with for years, are something along the lines of, well, if we're looking at, if we want to look at, we know we want to look at the liver on a CAT scan or something. Well, why don't we just capture the liver and go so far as even to sort of gray out all the other stuff that aren't the liver? There probably are some situations in which something like that would be appropriate. The problem is that's a very slippery slope. And so I wouldn't advocate going there yet. That is something to be thought about as time goes on, depending on how the mismatch in terms of volumes and readers goes.
And forgive me if I'm not understanding, but are there situations where graying out everything, or what if there is some sort of additional issue that you might have been able to catch, but then didn't because you're only looking at the liver?
Of course, that's the main kind of argument, is that, well, you acquired this data, didn't you? But you acquired this data, but now you sort of blotted it out. You redacted it in essence. And so weren't you supposed to look at that? And so I think under current medical legal system is structured, you're right. I don't think anybody would ever risk that. And I don't think, but what I'm saying is, what if I would turn that around? What I play devil's advocate is, what if in the best interest of what if we reach a point where the disparity is so great between the number of studies that need to be read and the number of people reading them? What if that common good is served by missing a few of those, but getting to all the studies that we can in a timely fashion? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that, right? I would say at this point, the disparity is not so great as to justify that, but one could certainly possibly, it's not hard to imagine that there could be, right, theoretically a time, one radiologist left on Earth and a billion studies, that kind of thing, you know what I mean? So I think that that's something that is what first came to mind for you is absolutely the right answer right now. But there is a universe where the common good could dictate otherwise. And it's something I think as time goes on, we have to at least be open to.
Yeah, I do feel the need to just address the listeners right now who maybe are screaming at their podcast, what about AI reading these images? That would certainly help this massive deficit of radiologists. But I don't really want to focus too much on that today as a possible alternative. I just read an article in the New York Times, actually, I think earlier this week. There was an article about how everyone's been screaming about an AI radiologist showing up any day now to start reading anything. And the reality of the situation is we're simply not there yet. You know what I mean? And I think to put all your eggs in that basket is playing a dangerous game at this point.
I agree. I think we don't know. We think we know that there's a when and not an if, but we really don't. And so there's still an if here about how much AI is going to take over. And there's certainly a when. And it's definitely not clear that AI can reduce or make the time management efficient enough to account for this growing disparity. It's hard to predict the future, right? We don't know. When it comes to AI, a good friend of mine has a great point. And his point is, are there more flights across the U.S. now in the post-advent of autopilot or before? Are there more flights, more pilots, right, or fewer? And people, I'm sure, would worry fewer, but no. There's a lot more pilots now than there were before. And that's because there's so many more flights, because it enables so many pilots. So what if AI comes along, does soak up a lot of that time and busy work kind of burden that I'm describing, maybe even more than busy work? What if it does? And what if that sort of changes the landscape such that now the payment structures change, and now it already seems like people get studies for everything, but not really, right? What if we really open the floodgates and we're right back where we started? Because even if we say AI comes along and reads a study that's a really protracted time frame, right, to when we're all going to be comfortable as a society saying, okay, well, nobody has to lay a set of human eyes on that at all, right? That's really far down the line. So what if AI comes along while we still have to supervise it and opens up the floodgates even more than it is now, and we're kind of right back to where we started? So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I don't know. But that's the point. As you just said, we don't know. So I think trying to rely on AI coming to solve our problems, as you just pointed out, I think is a mistake.
For sure. Running with this theme then, and just like almost leaving AI slightly out of the conversation, right? Like, let's focus on what we have now, what we know is coming outside of that realm. As this field is continuing to grow and adapt, where do you think it's adapting well, and where is it really starting to fall behind?
Like I said, I think we are falling behind. I think the field of radiology is falling behind a little bit in our ability to handle the workflow and in a way that doesn't completely commoditize it. I think we are falling behind a little bit. The other thing I would say is that I don't know. I'm going to say this is purely editorial. I don't have any proof. This is just a very much a gestalt, sort of an anecdotal take. But I do worry, to your point about it, I do worry that some really clever minds that could be coming up with the next MRI technique or the next, photon counting CT technique are instead chasing a kind of one-off AI application / solution. And, there's like this famous cover, right, of maybe it's MIT Review or something, and was a Buzz Aldrin on the cover. And he's got a kind of a very grim face. And he says, "They promised me colonies on Mars. I got Facebook." It's the idea that there's all these really clever people that could solve real problems trying to make some app and get rich really quickly, an app that orders pizza, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. And so I do worry, again, without any data to support this. I'm not saying somebody come along and show me data and say, oh, you're wrong. Okay. But just anecdotally, just seeing how much kind of hype there's been about AI and how much I do worry that field is overall putting a few too many eggs in that one basket.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I love an unsubstantiated claim. That's why we're here today, to record it and put it on the internet.
You should have me back every week then, because I'm really good at those. So
hell yeah. You did mention like new photon counting techniques,
new MRI techniques, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Can we dig into that a little bit? Have you seen like a slowdown potentially on new techniques coming out, or where is your mind
I have. It's a good question. I think the confounding factor on that, though, is with all these technologies is as they mature, there's fewer things to invent. So somebody could say, well, there really hasn't been sort of a very revolutionary idea in MRI in like a while now, adding bricks and stuff. But maybe that's just the natural course, and it has nothing to do with the fact that there is AI or anything else distracting us. So again, I would say that's where my feeling is that there's a few too many people doing some of those kind of hard science activities. And I am judging of just still based on lab sizes and again, like the pace as you're referring to, kind of the pace of invention. But I am aware that part of that is just the maturation of the technologies.
Yeah. Would you say super high level, like radiology kind of keeping up with the pace of change in healthcare at large? Is it ahead? Is it falling behind? Like, where is it compared?
I would say in general, I give us pretty good marks as to keeping up with the field. And what I mean by that is every time you turn around, there's a new kind of multidisciplinary task force that's come up with recommendations based on data for how to classify this lesion or that lesion or study this organ system, or if we're talking oncology, how to classify the response to treatments, that kind of thing. So I do think, and I just said there are new photon CT counting machines that are coming out and being studied. And what I would say is that radiology remains one of the reasons I love it, remains a very academic field, actually. Even though a lot of us now at this point have a vision of a radiologist, somebody who sits at home in his underwear, contracting with different hospitals and, and sort of commoditizing the system. And The reality is it remains amongst all the different specialties of very academic discipline. And so I do think we deserve good marks for keeping up with supporting clinical care as it advances. But like I said, I think where we need to watch out is the trend, the future. If we spend too much time focusing on one thing and other things fall by the wayside, that would be harder to maintain.
Yeah. Sitting around at home in your underwear sounds like a podcast host to me. Jokes aside. So, like, let's say a resident asked you, what should I be preparing for that we're not really talking about yet? What kind of answer would you give them?
Well, to be honest, okay, so there's two things I would probably say. I would probably say, and one thing we haven't talked about is that this gap that we're talking about that you mentioned, the when, right? If let's say we agree to say, okay, the AI is a when, not an if. Okay, fine. But that gap, what's that going to be filled in by? Is it going to be filled in by my idea of probably not actually, probably because the lawyers will probably have something to say about like my idea of, maybe we can look at studies differently, reports. It's what I think ought to happen. Doesn't mean it will. So I think one thing that's going to fill in that gap is radiology extenders, people who are trained as nurses, nurse practitioners, technologists, who then get trained to do, I don't want to use the word simple, they're not simple, but focused things like reading x-rays or interpreting ultrasounds, doing fluoroscopy studies, that kind of thing. There's a great resistance in radiology in general to that for obvious reasons. The idea that, that we're, again, just going to sort of give away what our specialty. But I think that argument is almost not even, it's coming. It doesn't even matter. Even if I tend to disagree with that train of thought, it doesn't really matter. It's going to happen because there is this need that's there. And so I would say to a resident, and I have said, that's going to be part of your practice in some way or another, whether it's now or, in a few years of that. In other words, like a radiology extender is kind of going to do what AI does, right, in the near term before it actually does it in the long term. And then I would say something which is very practical advice, which we don't tend to talk about in training, which is the nuts and bolts, the practicalities of how you practice what you're doing. Medicine's not very good at that, right? All the way up from medical school through these various residencies. We don't really get into how you conduct yourself in a practice to balance providing great care, having a life, making money, that kind of thing. So what I would tell them is, you, the resident, you see that there's a shortage of radiologists and a lot of studies and everybody's making a lot of money. But there's no magic money tree, right? It's not just because you pass the boards and become a radiologist, you still have to work very hard and very efficiently and read a lot of studies. And I think that that's something that actually, it seems like an obvious kind of, well, what do you mean? They're residents, they're used to it. But there's this idea that a lot of them have that, the market is so golden now, such a buyer's market. Yes, but that buyer's market comes with an expectation that you're really ready to roll up your sleeves and get down to business. So those are the two things that I probably harp most on outside of, AI, as we're saying.
Not to piss off any radiologists who might be listening, but I'm curious, about the pushback to the extenders, right? So there's effectively too many scans for the number of current radiologists in our country to be reading. We have a potential pathway to get extra eyes on those who will receive a level of training that should make their reading of those exams sufficient, right? Is the pushback like a pride thing? Is it, you know what I mean? Like what? Because I go to the greatest good for the greatest number. Let's get these exams read.
Well, I would say I think the counter argument is that the greatest good for the greatest number is still not diluting the expertise in the radiology pool, especially because there could be a slippery slope both within radiologists and then to other clinicians. For example, cardiologists already now participate for a while in interpretations of cardiac CT, very focused things. So I think that there's a legitimate argument to be made. It's not just economic protectionism. There is a legitimate argument to be made that, that dilution is not good for kind of global communal care. However, right, I think the competing argument is, what's also not good is people rushing through studies at the lower end of the reimbursement that still could have findings that are important just to get to the studies that are already too numerous that have the appropriate reimbursement. I don't dismiss the arguments on either side, But like I said before, I think that it is to some extent a moot point because the disparity is between the studies that are out there and going to be out there and the number of people to read them before AI really comes in and is like, okay, the solution is going to necessitate an expansion of that extender pool.
As a non-medical professional, I'm coming it from the attitude of like just seeing in my personal life, just like the amount of time sometimes that it takes A, to even get images at all, but then B, for someone to get around and reading to it and get to reading it. From my perspective, if I'm getting imaged, I'm like, yeah, get me an extender. Like, let's go. Yeah, let's figure out what the hell is going on.
And again, I think within reason, exams that sort of have a more focused range of diagnoses that can be delivered and stuff like that, where you can reasonably train somebody in that time period that an extender is willing to be trained. I agree with you.
We already did a 2-part episode on burnout, but I kind of am curious. For our listeners, I recommend, if you're interested in hearing more, 2 full episodes on radiologist burnout, to go listen to our episode with Dr. Elizabeth Krupinski. But Ari, I mean, from your perspective, we are seeing growing burnout all across healthcare, not just in radiology. We're seeing it across the entire field. Are there like systemic changes that you would make to make radiology more sustainable for practitioners? And maybe that could even help push back on the need for extenders to some degree.
Well, it's a tough one because there's nothing really that can be done. And I'm a radiologist, and more or less, I believe, should be done about the number of studies out there. Somebody will come and say, oh, it's a radiologist. No, actually, do we want to return to practicing medicine without eyes, in the 1960s? No, we invented these technologies for a reason. I think they are, by and large, applied appropriately. So it's a tough one because we're stuck with that growing number and we're stuck with the workforce. I think where I would probably say a little differently is I think no matter what, the extenders, again, in the absence, we're kind of talking about like this time in the absence of AI coming and solving things, the extenders are going to be a part of it. And this is, again, in a perfect world, we would have better reimbursement, honestly, for these that would allow the radiologists to spend a little more time on certain studies and delegate to radiology centers certain other studies and find whatever different practices, different patient mixes might be some different balance, whatever that is. There was actually a senator, I think he has a background of physician, who actually recently, I think, put forth a bill trying to increase reimbursement. We'll see where that goes, right? It's kind of unlikely, right? It seems it's not really expected that reimbursements are all of a sudden going to rewind the clock and go higher. But to answer your question, yes, those are structural changes that I would say, the system as a whole, Medicare, the insurance, have really valued these in a kind of appropriate way. I think that it would be, and radiologists felt less rushed, that would be an important step. And it would always, of course, also goes back to all this. This comes up in all of these conversations, right, about physician burnout, or should come up in all these physicians, and it extends to radiologists too, which is, most people, I did a PhD with my MD, so I was paid for. I didn't come out of med school with debt. But that's not the case with most people. Most people have debt. And it drives their financial kind of attitude and their outlook for a long time. So if we as a society want to sort of help out and say, well, maybe medical school should be free like it is in other places, that drives it starts. So the bottom line is the answer to a question like that is very multifaceted, complex, and starts all the way at the beginning of med school, really. So there's no quick fix to the burnout thing at this point, from kind of like it's like retrofitting a house. You don't have central AC, and there's no good way to do it, right? You can put in space packs and all that kind of stuff, right? Ultimately, if you really want like central air, you have to like rip out the wall, start over again, and that's kind of the way I feel about solving burnout for physicians and radiologists.
Yeah. So, I mean, then in that case, how do you navigate that tension between like clinical excellence, operational demands, administration? Like, is there a framework that you use to balance all these different aspects? Are you trusting your gut? Like, how do you,
as somebody who led a department, taught residents for a long time, I tried to always encourage people, what you just said, sort of to trust their training, trust their, not waste a lot of time on things that we touched about in the beginning of the episode. A lot of times the things that they know are 999 times out of 1,000, or more. not relevant just because they're feeling, neurotic. Make your day efficient and as stressful while maintaining the quality of your work. And then I think there's a component of what you asked, like people who have the privilege and the burden of having administrative time and duties. Those duties need to be in the service of making the workflow more efficient, making the workflow more rewarding. So that what you asked is there's certainly no one size fits all to, kind of balancing those more or less, say, three things that you mentioned. There's no, but I would say we as radiologists, I think as physicians in general, tend to operate with a lot of neuroses. Some of it's very justified. And I think that to the best of our ability, we have to try to let that go in the course of our, day-to-day work and be as efficient as possible. And I think the other thing is that one thing that is motivating, I think, and this is now specifically obviously to radiologists, is we like sharing cases, talking about technology. We like doing that. So one thing that I was not always successful in doing, and honestly, this is something in retrospect, I wish I had carved out more time, because I think the benefit with it is to create safe times and spaces to sort of just go over cases amongst radiologists and I think things like that add reward to what you're doing, these sort of, these incentive, that acts as an incentive and, recharges and makes you more efficient when you're kind of just churning through cases.
I mean, are there other traits, habits, or as you put it, neuroses that you try and instill in the next generation of radiologists? Or are there skills that you find that aren't taught in training that you think are essential?
I think most of them are taught in training. Most places are good. Most programs are good. And most teach all the necessary skills. I don't see really a glaring kind of, other than what we kind of spoke about before. I think it's important to teach up and coming radiologists the practicalities, the burden, how the workflow is going to go in terms of how to read a study, because I think the training remains pretty strong.
Great. Let's dig in a little bit towards like the leadership lens, but are there aspects of radiology leadership that you feel like need to be evolving with the times? Like you were saying, creating a space to get together and discuss images. And it's funny you say that because I lurk on the radiology subreddit, which is largely just cases, just to, see what's going on, see what the online community is up to. But are there aspects of leadership that you think need to be evolving more rapidly?
I would say that one particular area is, I think, like the remote work, again, based on the commoditization, because there's a demand based on COVID. It's like that poor stuff to barn, right? There's always going to be a substantial place in radiology for remote work. And there is, and I think would like to see more radiology leadership accept is the idea that there's a subset, it could be even a substantial subset, and it doesn't matter if it's academic, private, whatever, of your radiologists that are going to be remote, and you're going to expect a little more efficiency out of them, right? Because they're not dealing with certain things other people are doing. And we have the technology, right? You and I are using it right now, right? We have the technology to teach a resident a finding and how to go through a CT scan without physically sitting next to that person. So I believe that is still something that's lagging and lacking, is an acceptance on the part of radiology to allow more than they do now, remote. Right now, there is a lot of remote, but a lot of it is still sort of treated unequally, or it's sort of treated as, it's like reserved for certain graveyard shift or second shifts or that kind. And I believe that the radiology leadership needs to be more open to finding a better balance between remote people, read a few more studies, teach a little differently, and people who are on site. And the reality is it's sort of a myth that given the opportunity, all radiologists, all people would just work from home. That's not true, right? There's lots and lots of people who appreciate a balance, and there's lots of people who want to go in the majority of the time because they don't like sitting in their house, whatever it is. I feel as though that is something that is fine where it should be in radiology leadership.
It's almost like expecting the worst out of people, right?
Yes, that's right. And I think you raise a very good point there. And I think when you do that, you cause a lot of ill will, right? Because most people, again, physicians, these are doctors who had to be pretty close to probably the top of their class, right? Got into residencies, trained for, you did an intern year, did a 4 years of radiology residency. They're not slackers, right? They're not people who want to see their name show up in lawsuits and things like that. So that is a very good point when you kind of expect that people will take advantage, and that's what you really, honestly, that's what you set the stage for, right? Because I think the vast majority of the time when you're talking about radiologists, they're not looking to game the system. Yes, but some people I've never met, and I met a lot of them, I've never met a radiologist who didn't agree to the principle that, well, if I'm working 4 days from home, I ought to be expected to read a few more studies because I'm not commuting, that kind of thing. I ought to be expected to do X, Y, and Z a little extra. Never met one. Everybody's on board for those trade-offs.
I love the idea of somebody who's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to medical school. I'm going to finish residency. And then after that, it's just me and my tidy whities and a box of pizza. It's like, how do you?
To be honest, even in that kind of vignette that you just painted, that guy, woman, is still more than happy to put in the work, to get to work, more than happy to, maybe that person has to put on a shirt to do some teaching, via Teams. But I think that that's something that is really hurting a lot of practices and departments still, because they're not thinking creatively about how to mix in remote readers in a kind of more equal way. And I don't mean equal by number of studies, and I think that's hurting them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it also makes sense to some degree too, like to flip to the other side of it. Like, things are so busy, you do have so much going on, and you have to create effectively a brand new structure, a brand new framework, a whole new system to really make all of that efficient, which, if those structures and systems aren't built out already, like, who has the time to build them in the first place?
Right.
Okay, so let's take a big swing with a question. It might be too big, and we're wrapping up here. Let's talk like 10 years in the future, 2035. Like, in your mind, what is the ideal radiology practice looking like? And is it operating vastly differently from practices today? Is it look kind of similar?
It's funny, we're always, in the 70s, they thought, right, by the year 2000, we'd be living in domed cities, with this magic glass and stuff like that. So we're always way, way off on the time. So what you say is 2035 might be in my mind, I might be picturing 2045. I would say what radiology practices will settle into is some mix of radiology extenders along with AI. I think the farther into the future you go, there'll probably be a more AI, fewer extenders, and where the AI is very helpful in terms of the workflow, is very helpful in terms of kind of what we started the conversation with. AI is very helpful in terms of allowing you to just focus on the real upshot of whatever study you're reading and whatever recommendation you want to make. And I anticipate that reimbursement won't have changed for the better, but that, again, radiology will have adapted with those above mentioned things to create a little better balance of, and a little less burnout. I think a reasonable thing to both hope for and expect, when that's sort of 10, 15 years down the line.
I get you. Ari, Dr. Goldberg, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you on Frame by Frame.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure.
Yeah, we hope to have you back sometime, and we will talk soon. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Will do. Thank you.
Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging is brought to you by Imalogics. Here, you'll find engaging interviews with thought leaders, experts, and patients, sharing stories that showcase the transformative power of medical imaging. To discover how Imalogics is rethinking imaging in healthcare, visit imalogics.com. Be sure to subscribe to Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And from all of us here at Imalogics, thanks for tuning in.